What if I told you that right now, as we speak, Prince Harry's life hangs by a thread? That the man who once walked proudly beside his brother, Prince William, and stood as the son of King Charles, is now lying in a hospital bed in critical condition after a violent argument spiraled completely out of control, and that King Charles himself, along with William, were reduced to tears when they arrived at his bedside? Imagine the weight of those words. Imagine the storm raging behind palace walls. The world thinks they know the story of Harry and Meghan, the fairy tale wedding, the dramatic Megxit, the explosive interviews. But what if everything you've been told was only the tip of the iceberg? What if the truth is darker, more brutal, and infinitely more heartbreaking than anyone on the outside could have possibly imagined? Tonight, we peel back those gilded curtains and dive headfirst into a night of chaos that left the monarchy trembling, a family shattered, and a prince broken. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, let's start from the only place we can, the shocking confrontation that changed everything. You see, Harry and Meghan's relationship has always been described as passionate, sometimes too passionate. That passion, according to insiders, boiled over into something raw, ugly, and irreversible. The argument wasn't just loud. It wasn't just heated. It was catastrophic. But let's pause for a second. Let me ask you this. How many times have you seen Harry look genuinely happy in the past 2 years? Think about it. Compare the smiles of his youth, those candid moments with Diana and William, with the strained, awkward grins we see now. Doesn't it make you wonder what really goes on behind those mansion walls? Insiders say this wasn't an isolated blow-up. No, it was the eruption of years of suppressed rage, unresolved trauma, and bitter power struggles. Meghan allegedly wanted control over everything. The narrative, the children, the money, even Harry's fragile identity. Harry, torn between his wife and his family, was crumbling. That night, the cracks finally shattered. Imagine the scene. Shouting echoing through marble halls. Slamming doors. The sound of glass shattering against tile. Neighbors later claimed they could hear raised voices from outside the property. Think about that. For neighbors, accustomed to the silence of wealth, to hear chaos spilling out into the night, it must have been deafening. And here's the chilling part. One insider whispered that Meghan's voice carried above all others. Sharp, cutting, like a blade. Harry's voice, in contrast, was desperate, broken, pleading. Can you picture it? Can you hear it? A son of Diana, the once proud soldier, reduced to begging in his own home? But what happened next was even more disturbing. Now, let's dig deeper. Why does this matter so much right now? Because while the world was distracted with other headlines, royal tours, charity events, flashy red carpet appearances, something truly devastating was unfolding quietly, secretly, and dangerously behind the scenes. This isn't just about a fight between husband and wife. This is about the future of the monarchy. This is about the rift that could redefine Britain's royal legacy for generations to come. And above all, this is about a man who has become the symbol of rebellion, freedom, and controversy, suddenly finding himself at the mercy of fate. Do you think Charles could handle losing another son? Do you think William, who has fought tooth and nail to hold the family together, could survive another blow to his already fractured heart? Here's the cruel irony. Harry has spent years trying to distance himself from the monarchy. He's painted himself as an outsider. He's insisted he wanted nothing to do with the firm. But when tragedy struck, when his life was suddenly dangling by a thread, who were the first to arrive in tears? His father, his brother, the very men he accused of coldness, betrayal, and silence. Life has a way of ripping the rug out from under us, doesn't it? But we're not done yet. Because here's where the story gets even darker. When emergency services were finally called, whispers suggest it was already too late. Harry was barely conscious. His condition critical. His future uncertain. The mansion that once symbolized his escape from royal duty became the very stage for his downfall. Let me ask you, do you think Meghan made that call herself? Or do you believe, as some insiders claim, that it was a staff member who finally broke protocol and dialed 911? That tiny detail, that single act, might have been the only reason Harry is still alive. The silence from Meghan in the aftermath is deafening. Where was the wife who claimed to be his protector, his safe haven? Why were palace insiders the ones leaking emotional details about Charles and William, not Meghan's own team. Something doesn't add up, does it? Now, before we go further, let me remind you, this isn't speculation for the sake of drama. This is a puzzle, a trail of breadcrumbs that leads to one inescapable truth. This night changed everything. The monarchy, the marriage, the legacy, all of it. And as much as we've already revealed, there's still more. Much more. Shocking details hidden from the public eye. Silent whispers buried beneath royal protocol. Because what Harry endured that night wasn't just a fight. It was the climax of a ticking time bomb that had been waiting to explode. And once it did, there was no going back. So where does that leave us? We have a broken prince, a devastated father, a distraught brother, and a wife whose silence only fuels suspicion. But that's just the beginning. Because what came next, when the neighbors spoke out, when the details of that chilling 911 call leaked, when the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, that would take this story from shocking to catastrophic. And trust me, no one, not even Meghan herself, could have predicted just how far the ripple effect of that night would spread. Because if you thought this was just about a private argument gone wrong, you're about to be proven very, very wrong. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started like any other night. But by the time the clock struck midnight, the Sussex mansion had turned into a war zone. Shouts rattled the walls, doors slammed with such force that the neighbors claimed their windows trembled, and Prince Harry found himself at the center of a violent storm that would end with him being rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Now pause. Ask yourself this. How many fights have we heard about between Harry and Meghan? Rumors, whispers, little leaks that painted a picture of tension behind the glamour. But what if this wasn't just another marital spat? What if this was the night where years of resentment, fear, and power struggles came crashing down in one catastrophic explosion? Inside that house, the argument spiraled from sharp words into chaos. Harry, already fragile from years of estrangement from his family, was reportedly caught in a verbal crossfire that quickly became physical. Meghan, according to insiders, unleashed accusations that cut him to the core, claims that he was weak, that he was nothing without her, that his family would never take him back. Imagine the weight of those words. Imagine hearing, from the woman who vowed to love and protect you, that you are nothing. Doesn't it strike you as cruel, almost deliberately wounding? But it didn't end there. No, this was just the beginning. Neighbors later claimed they heard a crash, something heavy, maybe furniture, being overturned, glass shattering against the floor. And then Harry's voice, raised not in anger, but in desperation, pleading, begging. Does that sound like a man in control, or a man broken down to his lowest point? Now here's where it gets chilling. One witness swore they heard Meghan's voice slice through the night with words so sharp, they left the listener unsettled. You'll never escape me. Whether those exact words were spoken, we may never know. But the very idea of them tells you everything about the atmosphere inside that mansion. And then, silence. But silence isn't peace. Silence is the kind of pause that happens after an explosion. The kind of silence that makes you wonder what just happened and whether anyone is still standing. Let's rewind for a moment. Because to understand why this night spiraled so far out of control, we need to look at the pressure cooker Harry had been living in. On one hand, his loyalty to Meghan. On the other, the unrelenting pull of his bloodline, his duty, and his bond with William. That kind of tug-of-war tears at a man's soul. Haven't you ever been caught between two worlds, knowing that whichever way you turn, you'll lose something you can never get back? That was Harry's reality, and Meghan knew it. According to insiders, she used it. Every argument, every dispute, always circled back to Harry's failure to choose her fully. She demanded proof, loyalty tests, sacrifices. And on this night, Harry apparently snapped. But snapping doesn't always mean lashing out. Sometimes it means breaking down. Sometimes it means your body gives up before your mind does. So let's go back to that room. The shouting, the crashing, the pleading. What happened in those crucial moments between chaos and silence? Some say Harry collapsed, that he simply fell, overwhelmed by stress and emotion, hitting the ground with a force that stunned everyone present. Others whisper it was more violent, that the fight physically escalated, and that Meghan's temper flared in ways the public has never imagined. The truth, locked away behind palace walls and guarded by NDAs, may never be fully revealed. But here's what we do know. Harry was injured badly enough that paramedics would later describe the scene as critical. And that's where the timeline shifts. That's where this story turns from a domestic argument into a royal crisis. Imagine the call that went out to Charles and William. Picture them being woken in the dead of night with the words, "Harry has been hospitalized." It's bad. For Charles, already weakened by age and the pressures of kingship, it must have felt like history repeating itself. Diana, the phone call in Paris, the unthinkable loss. And now Harry, his own son. For William, the weight must have been unbearable. The brother he grew up with, laughed with, fought with, was now lying in a hospital bed, his life hanging in the balance. And worse, William wasn't even there to protect him when it mattered. Can you see the tears forming? Can you feel the helpless rage in their hearts? But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because before Charles and William ever set foot in that hospital, something else happened. Something that neighbors, staff, and insiders can't stop whispering about. When the shouting stopped and Harry was left collapsed, the 911 call was delayed. Yes, delayed. Why? That's the question no one wants to answer. Did Meghan hesitate? Did she refuse to make the call herself? Did a terrified staff member have to take matters into their own hands? That delay, those precious minutes, may have been the difference between life and death. Think about that. And here's where the story begins to twist. Because while Harry's life was slipping through his fingers, Meghan's focus, according to whispers, wasn't entirely on him. Sources claim she was already on the phone, not with doctors, but with PR advisors, trying to manage the fallout, trying to get ahead of the headlines. Doesn't that make your skin crawl? A husband on the ground, fighting for his life, and the wife allegedly worried about optics, about brand, about control. But this is Meghan we're talking about. The woman who has always been 2 steps ahead in shaping her own narrative. Would it really surprise you if she was already planning her next move before Harry's stretcher even left the mansion? Now, let's bring it back to Harry. Because in the end, that night wasn't about Meghan's strategy or the palace's panic. It was about a broken man, torn apart by years of pressure, now lying unconscious, perhaps even unaware of the chaos swirling around him. And this moment, was the turning point. This was the spark that ignited a firestorm across the royal family, across the media, across the world. Because once Harry was taken to that hospital, once the news began to trickle out, once Charles and William arrived in tears, nothing would ever be the same again. But the true unraveling didn't start in that hospital room. No, it began outside those mansion walls, with the people who heard the fight, who saw the flashing lights, who whispered their stories to anyone who would listen. Because while the palace tried to silence the truth, the neighbors were already speaking. And what they revealed made everything even more horrifying. And that's exactly where we're going next. Because what the neighbors said, and what they claimed to have heard that night, would paint a picture darker than anyone expected. And it would confirm one terrifying truth. This wasn't just a marital spat. This was something far more dangerous. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What would you do if, in the dead of night, you suddenly heard screams tearing through the stillness? Not the playful laughter of a family gathering, not the muffled sounds of music or celebration, but guttural shouts of rage and desperation coming from the house next door. That's exactly what the neighbors of Harry and Meghan reportedly experienced on the night everything went wrong. The Sussex mansion, usually cloaked in quiet secrecy, suddenly erupted into a storm that spilled beyond its manicured walls. And while palace insiders tried desperately to clamp down on details, the neighbors, those who lived close enough to hear, to see, to feel the chaos, couldn't stay silent. Their whispers have now become the key to understanding just how violent, just how terrifying, that night truly was. One neighbor, a woman in her late 50s, allegedly told a friend she had never heard anything like it before. It was like a war zone, she said. I thought something terrible had happened, but I didn't realize it was Harry and Meghan until the ambulance lights flooded the street. Think about that for a second. How bad does an argument have to be for a seasoned adult, someone used to the occasional row in any neighborhood, to describe it as a war zone? Another neighbor claimed the argument was so loud it woke their children. We heard shouting, then this horrible crashing sound, like furniture being thrown. And then there was this long silence. It scared us so much we almost called the police ourselves. Can you imagine being woken by that? Can you imagine looking out your window and wondering if royalty, yes, royalty, was tearing itself apart right next door? But the details get even more disturbing. One neighbor swore they could make out Meghan's voice above all else. Sharp, furious, accusatory. The words weren't entirely clear, but the tone was unmistakable, cutting, dominating, unrelenting. Harry's voice, by contrast, was described as broken, pleading. It didn't sound like an argument between equals, the neighbors said. It sounded like someone being torn down, piece by piece. Doesn't that description alone send a chill down your spine? And here's where it gets chilling. Several neighbors reported hearing something that sounded like glass shattering. A vase, perhaps, or a wine glass hurled against a wall. One even said it sounded like a door was slammed with such force that the house itself shook. These weren't the ordinary sounds of frustration. These were the sounds of destruction. Now, let me ask you directly. If you were in that position, if you lived next door to Harry and Meghan, would you have stepped in? Would you have called for help? Or would you, like these neighbors, freeze in stunned silence, not sure whether to intervene in a royal disaster? Because here's the brutal irony. While the neighbors listened in horror, Harry was inside that house slipping further and further toward disaster. His pleas went unheard, his pain invisible, except to those who later whispered what they'd witnessed to reporters. And what they said next makes this story even darker. According to one account, the shouting suddenly stopped. A silence so heavy, so unnatural, fell across the mansion that neighbors thought it was over. But silence can be deceiving, because just minutes later, they heard the sirens. Blue and red lights bathed the quiet neighborhood as paramedics rushed into the property. And that's when the neighbors knew this wasn't just another fight. One man described the scene as surreal. You don't expect to see an ambulance screaming down your street in the middle of the night for royalty. It was like watching history unfold, except we were standing in our pajamas, too afraid to even breathe. Imagine that. Ordinary people, standing in the shadows of their homes, watching flashing lights illuminate the downfall of a prince. Doesn't it feel almost cinematic in its tragedy? But it doesn't end there. Because what the neighbors heard in those final moments before the ambulance arrived left them haunted. One neighbor insists they heard Meghan's voice one last time, shouting something cold and unforgettable. "You'll regret this." The words lingered in the air, chilling the listener to the bone. Was it aimed at Harry? At the staff? At the situation spiraling out of her control? We may never know. But the very possibility makes your stomach churn, doesn't it? And then, silence again. Except this time, it wasn't peace. It was the silence of a man being lifted onto a stretcher. The silence of neighbors too stunned to move. The silence before the headlines would erupt worldwide. Now, here's where the contradictions begin. Some neighbors insist the fight was purely verbal, albeit terrifyingly loud. Others swear they heard the unmistakable sounds of violence, thuds, crashes, groans. The truth, buried under palace secrecy and media spin, lies somewhere in between. But whichever version you believe, the conclusion remains the same. Harry ended up in the hospital in critical condition. And here's the haunting part. Neighbors weren't just passive observers that night. They became the first link in a chain of whispers that would eventually shatter the palace's attempt to control the narrative. Without them, we might never have known just how bad it really was. Think about that for a moment. While Meghan may have believed she could spin this, while the palace hoped to bury it under protocol, it was ordinary people, neighbors with no agenda, who let the truth seep out. Isn't it ironic? For all the power and wealth in the world, the silence of a neighborhood could not be bought. And so the story spread. From whispered conversations over fences, to hushed tips to journalists, to explosive leaks in the media. The neighbors had spoken, and their voices carried a truth that neither Meghan's PR machine nor the palace's carefully worded statements could silence. But here's the catch. The neighbors' accounts, as shocking as they were only the beginning. Because when the 911 call itself began to leak, when details of what the operator heard, what the staff said, and how desperate the situation truly was, everything took an even darker turn. And it left no doubt that Harry's life was hanging by a thread. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Imagine the voice of a desperate staff member, trembling, breathless, struggling to stay calm while dialing 911. On the other end of the line, an operator repeats the same urgent question, "What's your emergency?" And then, in the most chilling words possible, the truth bursts out. Prince Harry is unconscious. He's not responding. Please, hurry. That was the moment the private chaos inside Harry and Meghan's home became a matter of public record. A frantic emergency call, logged, time-stamped, forever etched into the system. The night that had begun as just another argument was now spiraling into a life-or-death crisis. But what exactly was said during that 911 call? What did the operator hear in those frantic seconds? And what details have insiders dared to leak about the atmosphere of pure panic inside the Sussex mansion? Tonight, we dissect it all. First, let's start with the shocking detail. Sources insist Meghan wasn't the one who made the call. No, the voice on the other end was not hers, not calm, not calculated. Instead, it was allegedly a panicked staff member, breaking protocol, risking their job, maybe even their future, just to save Harry's life. Think about that. In a house full of wealth, power, and prestige, it wasn't the Duchess who reached for the phone. It was someone from the staff, someone who chose humanity over hierarchy. Doesn't that make you wonder where Meghan's priorities really were in those crucial minutes? The staffer's voice, according to one insider, was frantic. "We need an ambulance right now. He's not breathing properly. There's blood." Yes, you heard that right, blood. Whether from a fall, an accident, or something darker, it was enough to leave the operator scrambling to dispatch emergency responders with urgency. Now picture this. The operator on the other end is trained to stay calm, to walk the caller through steps that might save a life before paramedics arrive. But how do you give instructions when the situation involves royalty, chaos, and fear of exposure? Reports suggest the staffer was too hysterical to follow some of the instructions clearly. Is he conscious? Check his airway. Stay with him. Each command met with confused, trembling responses. One insider even claimed Meghan's voice could be heard faintly in the background during the call, not pleading for help, not comforting Harry, but shouting about control and the press. Can you believe that? In the very moment her husband's life hung in the balance, she was allegedly already worried about how it would look to the outside world. Doesn't that tell you everything you need to know about where her priorities lie? And here's another layer, the timeline. Paramedics later admitted that every minute counts in a situation like this. Yet the call, according to records, came late. Too late. There was a gap between Harry's collapse and the dialing of those 3 numbers. Why? Why the hesitation? Why the silence? Some say Meghan froze, unwilling to invite outside scrutiny into their private lives. Others suggest she was more concerned about who might leak the story than about Harry himself. But either way, those lost minutes nearly cost him his life. Now, let me ask you, if someone you loved collapsed before your eyes, would you hesitate? Would you weigh the pros and cons? Or would you grab the phone and scream for help immediately? That hesitation, whatever its cause, is damning. The most haunting detail, though, is this. According to one anonymous source, the operator logged that the caller described Harry as blue. Yes, blue. That means oxygen deprivation. That means his condition wasn't just critical, it was dire. His body was shutting down. Can you imagine the panic in that room? Staff members huddled around their fallen prince, one desperately on the phone, others trying to shake him, to wake him, to keep him alive. And Meghan? Still, to this day, her exact role in those moments is shrouded in mystery. But what is clear is that without that call, Harry may not have survived. Let's move outside the mansion for a moment. Neighbors later described seeing flashing lights racing down the quiet street, paramedics leaping from their vehicles, rushing inside with stretchers and equipment. They had no idea then what they were about to face. The son of King Charles, unconscious, battered, slipping further away. And yet, despite their best efforts, whispers suggest the first responders were horrified by what they found. One alleged witness said a paramedic was overheard muttering, "This should have been called in sooner." That sentence alone tells you just how close Harry came to death. But the story doesn't end with the call. Because once the 911 recording existed, the palace's nightmare began. You can bury rumors. You can silence staff. But you can't erase a logged emergency call. That call is now evidence, a ticking time bomb, ready to explode into public knowledge at any moment. And isn't that why, almost immediately after the ambulance left, frantic PR activity erupted? Why Meghan allegedly got on the phone with advisors? Why the palace scrambled to prepare statements? to get ahead of the story? Because they all knew, once that call leaked, the truth could no longer be contained. Now let's turn the question back on you. Do you believe Meghan deliberately avoided making that call herself? Do you think she prioritized image over Harry's life? Or do you think this was simply a tragic delay, the kind that happens when panic takes over? Whatever you believe, the facts remain the same. Harry was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and the world was just one leak away from discovering the horrifying truth. And here's the cliffhanger. Because while the call itself was chilling, what the paramedics found when they entered that mansion, and what they later told select insiders, was far worse than anyone could have imagined. This wasn't just about an unconscious prince. This was about a scene so chaotic, so violent, that even seasoned professionals were left shaken. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The front door flew open, and paramedics rushed inside. What they walked into was not the calm, orderly elegance one might expect from a multi-million-dollar mansion, but pure mayhem. Broken glass littered the floor, furniture was overturned, and the atmosphere was thick with tension, fear, and something else, something darker. This wasn't the pristine home of a royal couple. It was a battleground, a stage where an argument had gone too far, spiraling into chaos that left Prince Harry fighting for his life. But what exactly did the paramedics see? What details have insiders risked everything to reveal? Tonight, we walk you step by step through the wreckage of that mansion on the night Harry nearly didn't make it. The first thing responders noticed, according to leaks, was the smell. Wine, spilled and soaking into the carpet. The acrid sting of broken glass. Perhaps even a trace of something burned, as if candles or food had been knocked over in the chaos. The kind of sensory overload that screams, violence happened here. Then came the sight of Harry, sprawled on the floor, pale, unresponsive, his body showing signs of stress and injury. He looked gone, one alleged insider said. For a moment, they thought they were too late. And hovering nearby? Meghan. Her demeanor, according to whispers, was not one of panic but of icy control. She wasn't sobbing. She wasn't hysterical, another source claimed. She was pacing on the phone, as if trying to manage a crisis rather than mourn one. Doesn't that strike you as odd? Doesn't it make you wonder where her focus truly was? Now, imagine being one of those paramedics. You train your entire career for emergencies. But how often do you find yourself treating a prince in the middle of what looks like a domestic disaster? One responder reportedly muttered under their breath, "What the hell happened here?" as they stepped over shards of shattered glass to reach Harry's side. Another noted the bruising, the cuts, the alarming blue tint to his skin. Every second mattered, and yet the environment was so chaotic, so tense, that even professionals felt the weight of it pressing down on them. And here's the eerie detail. In the midst of that chaos, a single photograph frame lay shattered near Harry. Insiders say it was a family photo, Diana, William, and Harry as children. Can you imagine the cruel symbolism? As Harry lay unconscious, his childhood memories, his happiest days, were literally lying broken beside him. But let's not forget, the paramedics weren't the only ones in that house. Staff members lingered, visibly shaken, some crying, others frozen in shock. One staffer, it's rumored, whispered to another, "This was bound to happen." Bound to happen? What did they mean by that? Were they suggesting this wasn't the first time tensions had turned violent? And then there was Meghan. Reports conflict about her exact behavior. Some say she demanded the paramedics handle things discreetly, warning them of consequences if details leaked. Others insist she tried to deflect blame, shouting that Harry did this to himself. Both versions, however, paint a picture of a woman more concerned with perception than with her husband's fragile condition. Doesn't that contradiction tell you everything? The paramedics quickly went to work. Oxygen masks, defibrillator pads, frantic commands exchanged in clipped voices. But through it all, Meghan allegedly kept her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly to someone unseen. PR advisor? Lawyer? Ally in Hollywood? Whoever it wasn't Harry. Meanwhile, staff members stood frozen. Insiders claim one even whispered, "We can't hide this anymore." That phrase, haunting, powerful, suggests a history, a pattern, something deeper than a one-night argument. So here's the question. Was this really a sudden explosion, or the inevitable climax of years of volatility? As Harry was finally lifted onto the stretcher, the room grew eerily quiet. The sounds of medical equipment and hurried footsteps replaced the earlier chaos. And in that silence, a chilling image emerged. Meghan, standing off to the side, arms crossed, eyes cold, watching as her husband was wheeled away. One paramedic reportedly told a colleague later, "I've seen spouses devastated in moments like this. I've seen people collapse in tears. But her? She looked detached, like it was just another problem to be solved." Is that the reaction of a grieving wife or a calculating strategist? Now let's pause here. Doesn't this entire scene remind you of another royal tragedy? Diana, Paris, a sudden collapse, flashing lights, unanswered questions. The parallels are impossible to ignore. But this time, the chaos wasn't caused by paparazzi chasing a car. It was born inside Harry's own home. And just like Diana's story, this one is riddled with contradictions, cover-ups, and whispers too dangerous to ignore. But the mansion of mayhem held more than just Harry's body. It held evidence, broken objects, signs of a violent confrontation, perhaps even messages or recordings that have yet to surface. Insiders say police quietly took notes, even as the palace scrambled to keep everything under wraps. What exactly did they find? What photographs were taken but never released? What objects were bagged and labeled before disappearing into silence? Those questions linger like shadows. And here's where the story grows even darker. Because as Harry was rushed out of that house, clinging to life, Meghan allegedly turned to her staff and issued a command. No one says a word. A command laced with fear, control, and perhaps even desperation. But the truth has a way of slipping out, doesn't it? A way of seeping through cracks, whispered by neighbors, leaked by insiders, carried on the shoulders of those who can no longer stay silent. And that's why, despite Meghan's best efforts, we know what we know today. So where does that leave us? A prince on a stretcher, a mansion in ruins, a wife with icy control, a staff on the verge of rebellion, and paramedics carrying away not just a patient, but the heir to a fractured royal legacy. But this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because while the mansion of mayhem revealed the depth of the chaos, the hospital would reveal something far worse. Just how close Harry came to dying, and just how devastated Charles and William were when they saw him. And their tears, their raw grief, would shake the monarchy to its core. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The flashing lights tore through the night as Harry's stretcher was wheeled out of the mansion. Sirens wailed, neighbors stood frozen in disbelief. And within minutes the prince who had once walked proudly in uniform, the son of a king and the brother of an heir, was now fighting for his life in the back of an ambulance. Picture the scene inside that vehicle. Paramedics crouched over Harry, one monitoring his vitals, another adjusting an oxygen mask over his pale, unresponsive face. A third prepared a defibrillator, hands trembling but focused. The tension was suffocating. Every second felt like an hour. Every beep of the monitor was a reminder that his survival was hanging by a thread. But as chaotic as it was inside that ambulance, the chaos outside was even greater. The hospital had already been alerted. Critical incoming. Patient is Prince Harry. Imagine the flurry of activity. Doctors scrambling, corridors cleared, security teams mobilized, staff members sworn to silence. For the medical team, it wasn't just about saving a life. It was about saving that life. The life of a man whose every breath was tied to the monarchy, to the nation, to history itself. Let's pause here. Ask yourself, why did it take so long for Harry to get this help? Why did those precious minutes slip away while arguments raged, while silence stretched on, while staff hesitated to dial 911? Doesn't it gnaw at you that those delays might have been the very reason his condition became so critical? And yet, here he was, a prince who once fought on the front lines in Afghanistan, now lying helpless, his own body betraying him in a hospital emergency ward. Doesn't the irony sting? When Harry arrived, reports suggest the hospital had already been locked down. Security cordoned off the entrance, staff were forced to hand over phones, and the press was kept at bay. The stakes were too high. One photograph, one leaked word, and the truth would erupt before the palace could spin it. Doctors rushed Harry into trauma care. Tubes inserted, monitors strapped, emergency medication pumped into his veins. He's critical, but he's holding on. One insider claims they whispered. That phrase alone, holding on, is enough to make your heart sink. But here's where it gets chilling. According to one nurse, Harry's body showed signs of not just collapse, but injury. Bruises, cuts, marks that couldn't be explained by stress alone. What does that tell you? Was this really just exhaustion, or something more violent? Now let's turn to Meghan. Her behavior in the hospital has become the subject of furious whispers. Some say she stormed in demanding privacy, barking at staff, trying to control who was allowed in the room. Others insist she lingered outside, on her phone, refusing to be photographed looking distraught. But what is universally agreed upon is this. She did not break down in tears. She did not crumble at the sight of her husband near death. Not in front of anyone, at least. Instead, her composure was cold, detached, strategic. Isn't that strange? Wouldn't you expect fear, sobbing, visible devastation? And if she wasn't showing it, was it because she didn't feel it, or because she didn't want anyone to see it? Meanwhile, the true devastation was happening elsewhere. Because when Charles and William were informed, their reactions were nothing short of shattering. Charles, who had already endured the unimaginable loss of Diana, reportedly broke down when told his son might not survive the night. Not again, he whispered, according to one insider. Just 2 words, but they carry the weight of decades of grief. For William, the blow was brutal. The brother he had fought with, yes, but also the brother he had loved, protected, grown up beside, was now slipping away. Palace insiders describe William's reaction as unrestrained grief. No royal mask, no stiff upper lip, just a man crying for his brother. Can you picture it? The heir to the throne, who has spent years holding the family together, suddenly reduced to tears, powerless to save the one person who had always been by his side in their mother's shadow. Doesn't it feel almost unbearable? Back in the hospital room, Harry's condition continued to fluctuate. One moment, faint signs of improvement, a stronger heartbeat, a flicker of response. The next, alarms blaring as his vitals crashed again. Doctors worked furiously, sweat dripping down their brows, aware that history was in their hands. And yet, through it all, Meghan's presence remained controversial. Staff later whispered about her demanding to know who had leaked the story, who had spoken to the press, who had betrayed her. Can you imagine? While Harry hovered between life and death, her focus was allegedly on silence and control. But control was slipping away. Because outside the hospital walls, word was spreading. Neighbors had already whispered. Insiders had already leaked. And now, with Charles and William racing to their brother's side, the story could no longer be contained. Let me ask you, do you think this crisis will finally force the family back together, or will it only deepen the wounds? When you picture Charles and William walking into that hospital room, seeing Harry pale, fragile, attached to machines, do you think their tears will turn to reconciliation, or to rage at the woman many blame for putting him there? Whatever your answer, one truth is undeniable. The hospital emergency was a breaking point. It exposed every crack in Harry and Meghan's relationship, every fracture in the monarchy, every buried trauma of the past. But here's the twist. While Harry fought for his life, and Charles and William prepared to see him, Meghan made a decision, one that would send shockwaves through the palace, the press, and the entire world. And that decision? It would make an already unbearable night spiral into something even more catastrophic. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The news hit them like a hammer. For Charles, it was déjà vu, an echo of that phone call in 1997 when Diana had been lost forever. For William, it was worse than any battlefield, worse than any political scandal, worse than any feud. His younger brother, the boy who once chased him through palace gardens, was now lying in a hospital bed, clinging to life. They rushed, the king and the future king, abandoning protocol, leaving aides scrambling to catch up. Witnesses at the hospital later whispered about the sight of Charles, frail yet determined, moving quickly through the corridors, and William, his face pale and drawn, walking with a stiffness that revealed his terror. This wasn't pomp. This wasn't ceremony. This was raw humanity. A father and a brother, both broken by the sight that awaited them. When Charles entered the room, the dam broke. One insider described it simply. He wept. The King of England, a man raised his entire life to keep composure, to never betray emotion in public, stood by his son's bedside with tears streaming down his face. Imagine that for a moment. A monarch, head bowed, shoulders shaking, whispering Harry's name. "Stay with me, my boy. Please stay with me." William stood frozen for a moment at the doorway. He had seen Harry in countless states, smiling, laughing, angry, rebellious, but never like this. Pale, motionless, tubes running in and out of his body, machines beeping in the background. His brother, his partner in childhood mischief, his comrade in grief after Diana, looked unrecognizable. And William broke. The tears came in heavy, uncontrollable waves. Doctors and nurses stepped back, giving them space. Father and son, united in grief, mourning a man not yet gone but already hovering on the brink. But let's pause here. Doesn't it strike you as tragic that it took this to bring them together? Years of division, interviews, accusations, books, bitterness. And yet, one hospital bed erased it all. Isn't that the cruel irony of family? That sometimes it takes tragedy to remind us of what really matters? William reportedly leaned over, gripping Harry's hand, whispering desperately, "Don't you dare leave me. Not like Mom. Not like this." Those words, if true, must have cut through the room like glass. Diana's shadow, always there, now standing over her sons once again. For Charles, it was the unbearable repetition of loss. For William, it was the unhealed wound ripped open once more. And in that room, there were no titles, no crowns, no future kings, just a broken father and a shattered brother. But not everyone in that hospital room was mourning. Meghan's presence loomed, icy and divisive. While Charles and William sobbed openly, Meghan reportedly stood to the side, arms folded, her expression unreadable. Some insiders swear she muttered under her breath, blaming Harry himself for the crisis. Others claim she snapped at William when he suggested Harry needed peace, not drama. And isn't that revealing? In the very moment of near death, when a family should have united, Meghan allegedly drew the battle lines even sharper. Doctors eventually ushered the royals aside, urging calm, explaining that stress could worsen the situation. But how do you tell a father and brother to calm down when they're staring at the possible death of their Harry? Now here's where the story twists. One nurse reportedly said that Charles, unable to contain himself, collapsed into a chair, sobbing, muttering, "Why him? Why again?" Doesn't that sound hauntingly familiar? Almost identical to the grief of 1997, when Diana was ripped from their lives. William, meanwhile, allegedly turned on Meghan. "What did you do to him?" Words sharp, low, but full of fury. Staff members were horrified. Imagine the heir to the throne accusing his sister-in-law at Harry's bedside. But doesn't it reveal the depth of his suspicion? The room grew colder. The rift, which the world thought couldn't get deeper, had just cracked into something catastrophic. Let me ask you, when you picture Charles in tears, William pleading with Harry, and Meghan standing cold, whose side do you feel for? Do you see a grieving family broken by circumstance, or a fractured monarchy finally collapsing under the weight of truth? Whatever your answer, one thing is certain. This moment will haunt them forever. And yet, as emotional as that hospital scene was, it wasn't the end. Because Charles and William's tears were just the beginning of a storm. The palace could not hide this forever. The public would soon learn fragments. And Meghan's next move, calculated, icy, and shocking, would escalate everything even further. Because while Charles begged for his son's life, Meghan allegedly began preparing her own story, her spin, her version. And when that version collided with the raw grief of a king and his heir, the fallout would be catastrophic. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It was the coldness that struck people first. In the middle of a hospital room charged with grief, where Charles clutched his son's limp hand and William wept openly, Meghan stood apart, unmoved, arms folded, face set like stone. For the doctors and nurses, it was a sight they would not forget. For the staff who had rushed to the hospital in panic, it was confirmation of what many had whispered for years. Meghan's heart beats to a different rhythm. While Charles whispered broken prayers and William begged his brother to stay alive, Meghan's focus was elsewhere. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shaken, one insider claimed. She was on her phone, constantly. It looked like she was managing a crisis meeting, not standing by her husband's hospital bed. Can you imagine it? Your spouse lying in critical condition, and instead of falling apart, instead of collapsing in anguish, you're making calls. PR calls, legal calls, strategy calls. Doesn't that make your skin crawl? And this wasn't just about appearances. According to whispers from hospital staff, Meghan repeatedly asked doctors not about Harry's immediate survival, but about how soon he might be stable enough to leave without drawing attention. She wanted to know how long before the press caught wind, one nurse said. Not how long before Harry was safe, but how long before she had to answer questions. Let me ask you, does that sound like love, or does that sound like control? Charles, grief-stricken and unable to comprehend Meghan's icy detachment, allegedly broke down further. William, however, was furious. "Stop thinking about yourself for once," he snapped at her, according to one witness. Those words, sharp, public, devastating, hung in the air like a blade. This was no longer just a family crisis. This was an open battlefield. And then came the press. Within hours of Harry's hospitalization, whispers had already reached reporters. Paparazzi gathered outside the hospital, journalists scrambled for quotes, headlines prepared to erupt. Meghan knew it. She could feel the walls closing in. And so, in that sterile hospital corridor, she allegedly began shaping the story. PR advisors were called. Draft statements were circulated. Words like stress-related incident and precautionary hospitalization were thrown around. Words designed to soften, to sanitize, to control. But the truth, the bloody, chaotic truth, was far darker. And Charles and William knew it. Which is why they resisted. Tell the truth, William demanded. For once. But Meghan refused. She had built her empire on narrative, and she wasn't about to let this story escape her grip. Here's where the contradictions begin. Some insiders say Meghan insisted on being photographed leaving the hospital later, wearing dark sunglasses, playing the part of the concerned wife. Others claim she refused to be seen at all, fearing public backlash. Which version is true? Maybe both. Maybe neither. But either way, her focus was image, not Harry. And the staff noticed. One staffer allegedly whispered to another, "She's already rewriting the story." Think about that. While Charles wept, while William clung to his brother's hand, Meghan was already drafting her script. Now let's turn to the emotional impact. How do you think this made Charles feel? A man who had already lost his wife in circumstances shrouded by suspicion, now watching his son's wife behave in a way that raised even more questions. For William, it was unbearable. He had long suspected Meghan of manipulating Harry, but now he saw it in its starkest form. Coldness in the face of catastrophe. Is it any wonder insiders claim William told aides privately, "She doesn't care if he lives or dies"? The world outside didn't know any of this yet, but they would soon see the cracks. Because when the palace finally released a carefully worded statement, one rumored to be pushed by Meghan's team, it was vague, sterile, devoid of emotion. The Duke of Sussex is receiving medical care following an incident at his residence. He remains under observation. That's it. No detail. No humanity. Just cold words for a warm tragedy. Doesn't that sound exactly like a press machine, not a grieving wife? And people noticed. Social media lit up with fury. Where's Meghan's statement? Why isn't she at his side? Why does she look so detached? Questions piled up. The narrative Meghan had tried to control was slipping away. Here's the irony. In trying to control the story, Meghan only made it worse. Her cold stance, her detachment, her refusal to show raw emotion. It painted her as uncaring. It painted her as the villain in a drama that was already spiraling beyond repair. And that image stuck. For every carefully crafted line her PR advisors released, a dozen whispers leaked from inside the hospital. About her pacing the corridor. About her arguing with William. About her pushing for a quick discharge. The truth seeped out like water through cracks. And no amount of control could stop it. Now, let me ask you. Do you think Meghan's cold stance was genuine detachment, or was it strategy? Was she truly heartless, or was she playing the long game, preparing for a narrative where she alone controlled the spotlight? Whatever you believe, the result was the same. Charles and William were in tears, Harry was clinging to life, and Meghan was standing in icy silence, already looking ahead to the headlines. But this is where the story takes its darkest turn yet. Because while Meghan's cold stance shocked the hospital staff and devastated the royals, what came next sent shockwaves through the palace itself. A statement was drafted, a message approved, a line carefully crafted to calm the world. But once it was released, it had the opposite effect. Because the palace's attempt to downplay Harry's condition only fueled suspicion, and the insiders, furious at the cover-up, began to leak. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The palace phones rang through the night. Courtiers were woken from their beds, aides scrambled into action, and crisis meetings were called before dawn. What they were told was simple and horrifying. Prince Harry was in hospital, critical. King Charles and Prince William were at his side in tears. And Meghan? Meghan was already attempting to control the narrative. Inside Buckingham Palace, panic spread like wildfire. It wasn't just about Harry's condition. It was about the optics, the fallout, the history. Diana's ghost loomed over every whispered conversation. Could the monarchy survive another scandal tied to a hospital bed? Could Charles withstand the pain of losing a second loved one under suspicious circumstances? The mood was electric, frantic, and suffocating. Staff whispered in corners. Phones buzzed with secure calls. And in the middle of it all was one terrifying truth. The world would soon know. The first order of business was silence. Lock it down, one senior aide allegedly ordered. No statements until we have control. Palace communications teams raced to prepare talking points, each draft colder than the last. Words like incident, precautionary, and under observation were thrown around. But none of them told the real story. None of them revealed the glass on the floor, the shouting neighbors heard, the desperate 911 call. And yet, doesn't that sound familiar? Wasn't that the same strategy in 1997? Sterile statements while the truth spun out of control? The same cold precision that made the public suspicious then and now? But here's the problem. The palace wasn't the only player in the game anymore. Meghan had her own PR machine, and she was pushing it hard. Leaks to sympathetic outlets. Strategic calls to Hollywood allies. Rumors planted in American tabloids, framing Harry's collapse as stress-related and blaming the relentless pressure of the British press. Do you see what she was doing? In one stroke, Meghan tried to redirect blame away from herself and back onto the monarchy and the media. It was her classic playbook. Victimhood and control rolled into one. But the palace wasn't having it. For Charles and William, who had just broken down in tears at Harry's bedside, this was unforgivable. And for their staff, who were already stretched thin, it was war. Imagine the scene inside the palace's crisis room. Sleep-deprived aides huddled around a long oak table, cups of cold tea forgotten, papers scattered everywhere. Voices raised, arguing over strategy. Should they admit the truth and risk public fury? Or should they bury it and hope Harry recovered before too many questions could be asked? One aide allegedly snapped, "We can't bury this." Neighbors heard everything. Another countered, "If we admit the violence, it will destroy him, destroy her, and drag us all into the fire." Back and forth, back and forth. Every option dangerous. Every path leading to disaster. And then came the media. By morning, the press already had the story. Journalists outside the hospital. Reporters calling every palace line. Headlines screaming, "Prince Harry hospitalized after domestic incident." The palace's attempt at silence had failed. The story was out. And so, in desperation, they released a statement. Sterile, empty, cold. The Duke of Sussex is receiving medical attention following an incident at his residence. He remains under observation. But instead of calming the world, it did the opposite. Social media exploded. What kind of incident? Why so vague? Why the secrecy? People demanded answers, and the palace had none to give. And here's where things got even worse. Because the leaks began, disgruntled staff, furious at being silenced, whispered to journalists. Insiders revealed the 911 call. Neighbors came forward with what they heard. And slowly, piece by piece, the cover-up unraveled. The palace is lying. Meghan is spinning. Harry is critical. That was the chorus echoing online. Let me ask you, can a monarchy survive in an age of social media secrecy? Can carefully worded palace statements really hide the chaos of a violent night when neighbors, staff, and paramedics are all talking? The answer was already clear. The palace was losing control, and the fear ran deeper than just Harry's condition. For Charles, it was a nightmare scenario, another scandal that tied his family to tragedy, another echo of Diana's death. For William, it was worse. His brother's suffering was now public spectacle, and his fury at Meghan's role, coupled with the palace's cold denial, made reconciliation almost impossible. The institution they had sworn to protect was once again on the edge of collapse. But the most haunting part of this panic was what came next. Because in their desperation to cover up the truth, the palace unintentionally made it worse. One aide, trying to protect Charles, told a journalist off the record that Harry's condition was not life-threatening. Within hours, that lie was exposed when Harry's vitals crashed again. The palace's credibility shattered. The panic deepened. The monarchy, once again, was on the brink. And yet, the insiders weren't done. Because behind the palace walls, in hushed voices, staff revealed even darker details. Texts, messages, whispers that painted Meghan in the harshest possible light. And those leaks would not only expose the truth of that night, but also Meghan's deepest fear. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It began as whispers in hospital corridors and palace offices. A text here, a message there. Fragments of conversations from aides who had seen too much and could no longer stomach the silence. Soon, those whispers grew into something more powerful. Revelations that would rip apart the carefully constructed narrative Meghan was trying to spin. These weren't just rumors. They were first-hand accounts. Messages exchanged in real time during the fight. Descriptions of Meghan's fury, Harry's collapse, and the chaos that followed. The palace tried to shut them down, but once the dam cracked, the flood was unstoppable. And what those insiders revealed, it was darker, more heartbreaking, and more damning than anyone could have imagined. One insider described frantic staff group chats the night of the fight. Messages like, "Call 911 now. He's not breathing right." Another, "She's still screaming at him while he's on the floor." Can you picture that? Harry, unconscious, and Meghan allegedly still shouting, refusing to stop, refusing to soften, even in the face of near death. Another claimed Meghan barked at staff, "Don't you dare call anyone. I'll handle this." But a loyal staffer, terrified for Harry's life, ignored the order and made the emergency call anyway. That act of rebellion may have been the only reason Harry survived. Doesn't that chill you? Then came the private texts. Insiders leaked screenshots, messages allegedly between staff members in the minutes after Harry's collapse. "He looks blue. We can't wait. She's going to blame us for this." The desperation leaps off the screen. And the most haunting message of all, "If he doesn't make it, this is on her." Can you imagine being in that house, seeing Harry lifeless on the floor, knowing every second mattered, and hearing Meghan order silence? Doesn't it make you wonder how much worse it could have been if the staff hadn't defied her? But the revelations didn't stop at texts. Staff began to talk openly, quietly, anonymously, but openly nonetheless. One aide told a reporter, "This wasn't the first time things had gotten physical, but it was the worst." Another claimed Meghan had a history of explosive rages behind closed doors. "We were always on edge, always waiting for the next eruption. But no one thought it would end like this." That detail is crucial, because it suggests this wasn't a one-off. It was a pattern, a ticking time bomb that finally went off. And here's the irony. Meghan's attempt to control the story, to spin it as stress, exhaustion, or media pressure, only made the insiders angrier. They saw their prince fighting for his life, while his wife manipulated the headlines. They couldn't stomach it, so they leaked. One particularly damning account came from a nurse who had been briefed on Harry's condition. "There were injuries inconsistent with a simple collapse," she whispered. "Bruises, cuts, impact wounds." It was clear this wasn't just exhaustion. Think about that. Those words alone, inconsistent with a simple collapse, are enough to change the story forever. But the most explosive revelation wasn't about the injuries. It was about Meghan's fear. According to one palace insider, Meghan confided to a close ally during the chaos, "If this gets out, I'm finished." Finished. That was her word. Not Harry's dying, not my husband needs help, but I'm finished. Doesn't that speak volumes? Her deepest fear wasn't losing Harry. It was losing her power, her image, her carefully crafted role as the victim hero in the royal drama. And that fear drove her every move that night. The hesitation to call 911, the icy stance at the hospital, the desperate PR spin, all of it rooted in one thought: survival. Her survival. Now let's bring this into focus. Imagine Charles, already broken, hearing whispers of Meghan's words. Imagine William, already furious, learning of the staff messages that contradicted her story. Their tears for Harry turned to rage at Meghan. And that rage? It would fuel decisions in the days to come that Meghan could never have predicted. Because if the insiders were telling the truth, and all evidence pointed that way, the monarchy wasn't just dealing with a health crisis. They were dealing with a scandal that threatened to consume them all. But here's where we pause. Do you believe the insiders? Do you think they risked their jobs, their security, just to spread lies? Or do you think their grief, their loyalty to Harry, pushed them to finally break their silence?